Before the United States was even born, a single night in London nearly changed the future of the entire Western world. A secret letter, a dying king, and a conspiracy powerful enough to ignite a war that could have rewritten American history before it ever began. This is the forgotten tale the British Crown never wanted the world to know. On a winter night in London, when fog lay heavy over the Thames and the city moved like a sleeping animal, one small hand reached for a page that should never have been read. My name for this night is unimportant. The man at its center wasn't important in any public record. He had no title, no coin of glory, and when his life ended, he was given no monument. He was, for all the world, invisible. He was a clerk, one among many, tasked with copying the official letters of a restless empire. In the cold stillness of Westminster's back rooms, by the weak light of a single candle, Edward found the paper. He had been transferring lines in tidy hands for hours, names, dates, the dry mechanics of diplomacy. That night, his quill slipped into a fold that hid something else. A page folded twice, bound with a wax seal that bore the emblem of a noble house. He opened it. The words inside read like a confession and a map. A noble's handwriting confessed loyalty to a king who had been driven across the sea. It described rendezvous in the north, a signal to be raised from a coastal bluff, and a plan that would welcome foreign ships into British harbors. For a man like Edward, the truth was a dangerous cargo. It could get him praise, or it could get him killed. It could change the course of a nation, or lay his bones in the mud outside the city gates. He made a choice. He ran. He fled through corridors, past portraits that watched in oil, through a London that held its breath. Outside, the fog swallowed his footsteps. Inside, the palace rooms were locked and quiet. He reached the river and the bridge with the letter beating against his chest like a small hot heart. And then, the feeling anyone would know who has ever raced against time, he felt the weight of eyes in the dark. He was not alone. Footsteps echoed. Someone meant him harm. But luck, or a friend who had heard his muttered alarm earlier, put city guards between Edward and the blade. A short, violent scuffle on the bridge, a flash of steel, a shout. The would-be assassin slipped into the fog, and Edward stumbled onward, breath burning cold, until he found the door to Parliament and laid the page on the table. Words like that, read aloud in wood-paneled rooms where men wore badges of authority, had power. They moved committees. They moved kings. Within weeks, a law was hammered into place, the Act of Settlement, so that the succession to the throne would be defined by creed and by Parliament's will. The crown would remain Protestant. But the letter did more than dictate a law. It opened a wound into which other dangers poured. Jacobite agents moved in the shadows. Factions chose sides. The act did not quiet the world. It set a boundary and sharpened old knives. Tonight, listen for the small things. The feather of a quill across paper, the hush of boots on stone, the catch in a man's breath. For the greatest deeds often begin between heartbeats. Edward's life changed after that night, but not in the ways songs promise. He joined a quiet circle, a grave, secretive band of men and women who tracked rumors and code, who opened envelopes not to steal, but to preserve. They called themselves the Silent Circle, and their work became the engine of survival for a kingdom that did not yet know whether it would survive. I want you to picture the clerk's hands again. They trembled. They were the hands of someone who understood that truth could burn as much as fire. He kept his face composed in Parliament, but each morning his eyes betrayed him. They were older, sharper, and haunted. The letter was the first turning point. the chase across London Bridge, the second, the law that followed, the third. Messages crossed the channel, flags were wrapped in caution. And through all of it, small, stubborn, and unseen, men like Edward bent themselves to a new kind of warfare, the war of whispers. The Silent Circle had no armor. They owned papers, gossip, tavern wit, and the kind of familiarity with human weakness that let them read a man's guilt in the way he refused a question. They planted false news sometimes to flush traitors from hiding, and they saved lives by intercepting poisoned cups or pointing a guard down the right alley. But any system has cracks. For every spy who saved a life, there was a betrayer who sold a name for a coin. The world becomes messy when people barter loyalty. In the end, history remembers laws and battles, kings and crowns, but not the clerk who bent over a table and chose to run. So when you walk through the corridors of old power in your mind, remember the page tucked into an envelope, the wax seal, the quiet fear that makes a man move faster than he has ever moved in his life. Remember that empires are built and kept not only by armies and fleets, but by small, unglamorous acts of conscience. Tonight's chapter ends with Edward alive, the letter delivered, and Parliament suddenly aware that the enemy was not only at sea, but sometimes dangerously inside the house. In the next hour, we will follow him farther, into mountain huts and hidden coves, where the empire faces a hidden war, and where one clerk must become a kind of shadow to keep the flame of Britain alive. If London was a crowded theater of diplomacy, the Highlands were a wild stage where loyalties were sworn with blades and songs. Edward's next task was not in a comfortable office. He walked north disguised as a merchant, a shabby cloak, a sack of barley, and a learned stillness. The Highlands offered him wind, wolves, and a kind of truth that cities conceal. People there answered to old loyalties, not to the ink of Parliament. In a stone hut, 6 men schemed beneath a smoke-dark ceiling. They spoke of fleets crossing the sea, of a pretender who would ride into Edinburgh with drums and trumpets, calling all clans to rise. They believed, fiercely and simply, that the right king meant the right law, the right faith, the right honor. Edward hid in the cold and listened. He stole facts as a farmer steals seed, quietly, carefully, pocketing names and dates that would become signals back in London. He learned of a planned landing, of a cove that could shelter small ships, and of a captain who trusted his compass more than his words. He left by moonlight, but the mountain kept its own counsel. A hunting party found him at dawn, and his story, a merchant out of season, nearly failed. He bartered the last of his food, paid a fiddler for a distracting tune, and finally slipped away with the map memorized and a scar in his side he would later hide beneath his coat. Back at sea, the British Navy patrolled like a moving wall. Edward's message, delivered by coded courier, instructs captains to watch a certain inlet. On a gray morning, long masts crested the horizon. Not the arrogant array of a formal fleet, but stealthy transports searching for a landing. The Navy struck, cannons rumbled. The attackers scattered like gulls before a storm. The hoped-for invasion turned into a stranded rumor. Yet even a failed landing changes the mood of a nation. Distrust whipples, taxes tighten, and local lords grow suspicious of their neighbors. The Silent Circle celebrated quietly. They had stopped ships, yes, but the victory felt hollow. For when men know they can be watched and stopped at sea, they begin to watch one another at home. Neighbors traded accusations, old feuds flared into modern politics. Edward learned another thing in the Highlands: the human heart keeps contradictions. He met a clan leader who loved the crown in theory, but hated English taxes in practice. He met women who hid messages in loaves of bread because they couldn't bear to lose sons to war. In every exchange, Edward's files filled with details of humanity, not just strategy. Spying is a dirty business. It eats at the soul. The more secrets you carry, the more ghosts you invite into your sleep. Edward would return from missions darker, speaking less of joy and more of necessary cruelty. We must break a man's will to save 1,000 lives. But duty carries a clarity. When a ship is sighted on the wrong shore, have you doubt or action? Edward chose action. He rode with a messenger to a small coastal fort and convinced the commander to hold one of his gun decks ready. That night, the bluff was under watch, the transports never landed, and families who would have been uprooted slept in their beds. Not all spies carry daggers. Some carry medicines, some carry loans, some carry lullabies. Edward used all of it. He bribed a cutter's helmsman, whispered a false route into a captain's ear, and sent a note disguised as a tax bill that read like a summons. It was social work in a dangerous costume. The Jacobites, for their part, adapted. They became more careful in their meetings, they changed coves, and they began to use women as couriers because no one expected a housewife to be carrying a manifesto. Civilizations invent new arts of secrecy when old ones fail. And then, one night on the coast, Edward watched a single lantern wink off in the dark, a small sign that the enemy had grown cleverer. In that instant, he understood that the war had evolved from armies to habits. The next battle would not be at sea or field, but in trust itself. The Silent Circle expanded its roster. Mathematicians who broke codes, a disgraced officer who could read troop logs, a tavern owner who spread false news to draw spies into the open. Each success carried a cost. To stop a landing, sometimes a life had to be sacrificed, or a family shamed. Edward kept the tally silently, like a man balancing accounts he did not want to balance. By the end of the decade, the tides had turned many times. The Pretender still plotted in the wings of Europe, but French and Spanish interest cooled. Edward had sent enough intelligence to make invasion dangerous, and in return he had earned enemies deeper inside the corridors than he had first feared. Outside the Highlands, cities bruised and newspapers shouted. Inside the Silent Circle, men gathered at midnight to measure rumor and truth like coin, passing pages under the table in little exchanges that smelled of ink and danger. Edward, who once only copied names and dates, now taught lessons in survival. How to speak without saying, how to lead a man without his knowing it, how to deny yourself sleep until your mind numbed to the shape of risk. If you listen carefully, you can hear the country change under the boots of these small people. The Navy learns a channel. A village learns to spy. Parliament learns to distrust. And throughout it all, a clerk who started with a single letter becomes the mapmaker of survival for a nation that had to learn how to watch itself. When the month closes on this chapter, remember, an invasion repelled is not the end of war. It is only the beginning of a new front, in which secrets multiply like seeds and trust becomes a currency harder to spend than gold.
Years pile like papers. Men who sprint one decade become slow in the next. The shadows they chase become the shadows that chase them. Edward was not young anymore. The years of crossing mountains, of furtive meetings and sleepless nights had bent his shoulders. But still he rose each dawn to a desk that had once seemed to hold the whole of his life's purpose. Now it held only the residue of it. Files, receipts, clipped names in neat old pens. The world had changed. Queen Anne was gone. George of Hanover had crossed the sea. The Pretender's armies had sputtered and failed. Yet wounds remained. The 1715 Rising had burned fields and hardened hearts. Men had died on Sheriffmuir. Villages had lost the threads that stitched them to the rest of the kingdom. Edward found the second letter by chance, tucked behind a ledger from years earlier. Its ink had browned, but its claim cut like a fresh blade. It said, in careful hand, that the earlier letter, the one that had saved the palace and altered succession, was not what it seemed. It had been, the note suggested, an elaborate bait. The conspirators had wanted to reveal who among the loyal household would move to stop them. In that plan, certain names were left exposed to be tested, to draw opponents of the pretender into the light where other plots could be unearthed. The idea staggered Edward. Had he been part of a grander game, a move on a chessboard he had not known he played on? Or had he merely survived the selection of those who wanted someone to save? He considered the possibility that someone inside the power he had defended was no protector but a manipulator, a puppet master who valued chaos as a tool and truth as a lure. Who benefits from a saved crown that keeps its enemies close? He thought of Lord Somerset, the noble whose hand had trembled on the original page. He thought of tavern-born whispers that matched the handwriting in the second note. He thought of a face he'd seen in a procession, a minister who smiled too readily, a man whose laughter carried the cold ring of calculation. Yet Edward could not lay bare all he felt. The machinery of state moved like a great machine. Pulling a single gear might cause 1,000 to stop. He locked the second letter back into the chest. He placed the key in a fold of his vest and resolved to carry the weight alone. The 1715 rebellion had already shaken the kingdom. Men marched with a king in their heart and a fear in their gut. In the fields at Sheriffmuir, men met with muskets and cries, but the result was messy. Neither victory nor decisive defeat. It was a mirror of the age. Much blood for little clarity. Edward stood in the shadow of the fights and sat with the aftermath. He saw widows in the market whose husbands had left rich in spirit and poor in coin. He saw children who had no father to show them the trade. He wrote the names down. He remembered them. He attended a funeral under drizzle and walked away with mud on his boots and a grief in his chest he could not name. The silent circle continued to do its work, though the urgency had changed. They monitored, they advised, and sometimes they brokered quiet reconciliations between wronged parties. Theirs was the art of prevention rather than the glamour of victory. Theirs was the art of prevention rather than the glamour of victory. In a small, private moment, one of Edward's old comrades asked him if the crown was safer now than the night he found that first page. Edward looked at the man and said, "Maybe, but we are all older. The danger has simply learned new faces." And then came the letter that changed his understanding of why he had lived so long in the shadows. The second note's implication that the first letter was bait meant that those who had engineered the trap had also engineered the survival of their loyal servants. Someone, somewhere, had wanted to see loyalty revealed, and had used the drama to document it. He thought of the puppet master idea again. If true, it meant some power preferred a government that was always threatened, for threat breeds dependency. Bargains are forged in fear. The nation grows obedient in small measures. Edward did not bring this accusation to light. He filed the second letter away because he feared it would be used as a weapon as much as a truth. Instead, he wrote quietly, notes and corrections, and a list of names to protect. He found solace in small acts, helping a widow secure a pension, ensuring a boy gets an apprenticeship, recommending a sickly soldier for care. These were the public goods of a private conscience. The years wound on. The pretender faded. Empire shifted, and the world turned to new wars and new markets. Edward kept walking his quiet path until his body would not let him walk further. He died with no trumpet fanfare, no flag on his grave. A few who had known his name or his work remembered him in whispered thanks. But the country he had saved, if saved it could be called, went on. Britain moved into a century of expansion and commerce, of colonies and laws that would reach across the globe. The tiny, secret campaigns of men like Edward were the invisible seams that kept the fabric together. In the end, the lesson is not a tidy judgment. It is this: a single person may change the course of nations by small, steady hands. The letter in our story did not only announce treason, it announced a different kind of duty, the duty to act when the quiet requires courage. If you ever encounter a quiet person who does the small, dangerous tasks, regard them kindly. They may be holding the pages that keep a nation breathing.